The New York Times has called Michael Chabon, right there, an immensely gifted writer and magical prose stylist. He is the best-selling and Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which won the Pulitzer. Whatever, Michael. The Mysteries of Pittsburgh and Wonder Boys, to name just a few. He is the chairman of the board of the MacDowell Colony, the oldest artist colony in the United States, and lives in Berkeley, California, with his wife, the novelist Ayelet Waldman, and their children. His new novel, Telegraph Avenue, is the great American novel we've all been waiting for. Generous, imaginative, funny, moving, thrilling, humane, triumphant, it is Michael Chabon's most dazzling book yet. Michael Chabon.
Thank you. First of all, I probably shouldn't say this, but I can't help myself. I'm a total nerd, as I think some people here know, and Lieutenant Savik, thank you. It's very exciting for me to be standing on the same podium as Lieutenant Savik. Thank you. I feel better now, thank you. When you have a new book out, this strange thing happens where you're called upon to account for it. How did you come up with the idea? Why did you start writing this book? Where did this book come from? It's probably one of the most frequent questions that you get asked, and at least in my case, I don't know about you guys, but the truth of the matter, the truest answer would be to say I have no idea whatsoever. I don't really know how I started or why I started or where it came from, and yet you have to, that's not a very satisfying answer. So you have to come up with a kind of a legend of the book and how it got started. So this is my first attempt. Just bear with me, tell me what you think. Telegraph Avenue is set in Oakland and Berkeley, but it was born in Los Angeles on October 3rd, 1995, the day the jury in the O.J. Simpson murder case made its decision known to Judge Ito and the world. To the extent that I had felt anything about the case before the verdict was announced, it was only that it seemed pretty obvious Simpson was guilty and should therefore go to jail for the rest of his life. When I heard the news from the courthouse, I was shocked, but not really surprised. I was married to a defense lawyer at the time. I'm still married to her, only now she writes books. I knew that the prosecution, like the defense, has one job to do, and if they do it poorly, then they ought to lose the case. Then my wife called from the federal building in downtown LA where she worked. "We're watching from our windows," she told me. "People are dancing in the street." Well, that surprised me. I turned on the television and saw scenes of the apparent jubilation of LA's black community, and it caught me completely off guard. I say apparent jubilation because I was aware that all I knew about the response of black people to the verdict was what I could see on my television screen. There were no black people living on my block of Orange Drive in the LA neighborhood called Hancock Park. At that time, I had one black friend, and it wasn't like I was gonna call him up and go, "Yo, Jervy, are you jubilating?" I knew enough about the media and its portrayal of black people, its portrayal of everything, not to accept prima facie the implication that all black people were delighted to see OJ get off. But it was clear that many of them were at least prepared to seem delighted in front of the television cameras. And that surprised me. It surprised a lot of white people. And the more white people like me in the days that followed expressed the surprise they have felt at the sight of people dancing in the streets because a man who had obviously murdered his wife escaped justice, the sadder I became. This sadness had little to do with the victims, God forgive me, or because of the miscarriage of justice, or because such public celebration suggested the degree to which black people felt estranged from and brutalized by the criminal justice system and wanted some kind of recompense for the acquittal of the men who beat Rodney King. I was sad because I knew that my astonishment at the public celebration, like the astonishment of any astonished white person under the circumstances, was indexed directly to the absence of black people in my life. It was the blinking indicator on my dashboard, letting me know that my connection to the lives and feelings of black people had been cut. In the fall of 1969, when I was 6 years old, my family moved to Columbia, Maryland, and I got my first good look at the marvel of a black person's hand. Until then, I had known few black people, and I had no real consciousness of race apart from what I had derived from television and movies and half-understood adult conversation on the subject, not all of it enlightened. Martin Luther King assassinated, cities on fire, Angela Davis's Montgolfier hairstyle, Curt Flood upsetting white baseball fat cats, my grandmother's cryptic warnings when she took me walking through her Washington, D.C. neighborhood, Sammy Davis Jr. belting out the Candyman on the Merv Griffin show. Columbia was a new town, a planned community, a city of the future, built ex nihilo in the middle of tobacco country, about 40 miles from Washington, D.C. It was avowedly utopian in its aims, transformative in its ambitions. It boasted large, well-tended swaths of public greenbelt, schools without classrooms, free public transportation, a single ecumenical worship center shared by all faiths, streets named for the works of great poets and novelists. Most wondrously of all, the city of the future was integrated. On the street where I grew up, there were more black families than white. On the next street over, the reverse was true. I tackled, head-faked, ate dinner with, teased, admired, quarreled with, lusted after, learned to dance from, had crushes on, watched television, and eventually drank beer with black girls and boys from the time I was 6 until the day I left for college. On that day, early in my first September in Columbia, I found myself placed next to a black kid named Darius, and I just sat there, as I say, marveling. His hair was dense, buoyant, and lustrous, his pupils hidden in the deep brown irises of his eyes. But what amazed me most of all were his hands. The skin on their backs was an intense, complex hue that held elements of brown and a luminous purple. But when Darius turned his hands over, when he permitted me to turn them over myself, the skin of his palm was as pink as my own. Along the outer edges of each hand and across the inside of each wrist ran a mysterious frontier between pink and brown that I patrolled with the tip of a finger. It felt as if some deep explanation, the answer to some question I could not even begin to pose, lay concealed in the pink palms of his hand and the way they contrasted with the brown of the backs. As I came to understand it over time, the idea of building the new town of Columbia was to make life better in America. One way the people who built Columbia saw fit to do that was to give white people and black people the chance to engage in the radical activity of living next door to one another, unrolling sleeping bags in the den for one another's children, swimming in public pool water that has been equally tainted with the urine of those same freely mingling kids, touching one another's hands. The success of this dream, dreamed originally by Mr. James A. Rouse III, may be open to debate, but from the day I turned over the mystery of Darius's palm, I was plunged into intimacy with black people with all the unreserve and boldness of Mr. Rouse's and my own small visionary heart. I was taught by black teachers alongside black children from diverse backgrounds, poor and middle class, southern and northern, country and ghetto, army brats and the children of black lawyers and doctors, that the battle for civil rights was a shining part of American history, very much on the model of the Second World War. A terrible conflict had consumed the efforts of people I considered to be my personal heroes, and then the good guys had won. For proof of this, I needed to look no further than my best friends, my neighbors, my favorite teachers, many of whom had dark skin. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Dr. Charles Drew, in the City of the Future in 1970, a young Jewish boy could look at the lives of these people and feel connected to them, indebted to them, in a very real way, descended from them. Because if there was one salient fact about the Black history that I learned from the lips of Black teachers as a boy growing up in Columbia, Maryland, it was this: Black history was my history too. Black music was my music, and Black art was my art. And the struggles and sufferings of Black heroes were undertaken not just for the sake of their fellow African Americans, but for my sake and for the good of us all. When I left the City of the Future to attend college in Pittsburgh, I began the journey that eventually landed me at last in the capital of the eternal American present, Los Angeles, California. And on that morning of the Simpson verdict, I discovered to my shame, to my absolute wonder and horror, that in the course of that journey, I had somehow become a racist. To qualify as a racist, you don't have to go to the extreme of slurring, stereotyping, or discriminating against people of another race. All you have to do, as I realized on that autumn morning in 1995, is to feel completely disconnected from them. All you have to do is look at those people in a kind of almost scientific surprise as I looked at the African Americans I passed in the streets of LA in the days after the Simpson verdict, and realize you've been passing them by in just this way for months, for years at a time. They were here all along, thinking what they think now, believing what they now believe, and somehow you failed to notice. That was the source, then, of the sadness I felt when I turned on the television and watched Black Los Angeles exult. The sudden, bitter awareness of failure, of blindness, of the apartheid of consciousness under whose laws I had gradually come to live, of the distance that separated the man in Los Angeles, around whom 100,000 humans could suddenly materialize, from the boy in Columbia, the son of Tubman and Drew and Miss Rosa Parks. A couple of years went by, and my wife and I moved to Berkeley, California, yet another would-be utopia, a city of potterers and amateur divines, of people so intent on cultivating their own gardens, researching their own theories, following their own bliss, marching to their own drummers and dancing to the tinkling of their own finger cymbals, that they take no notice of one another at all, or would certainly prefer not to if it could somehow be arranged. People keep chickens in Berkeley. There are 2 very loud hen houses within a block of my house. There may be no act more essentially Berkeley than deciding that the rich flavor and healthfulness, the simple, forgotten pleasure of fresh eggs in the morning outweighs the unreasonable attachment of one's immediate neighbors to getting a good night's sleep. And yet there turned out to be another side to Berkeley's utopian leanings, a yearning for fellowship, for a kind of collective fulfillment out of which are born ashrams, synagogues, restaurants, dojos. I encountered it primarily in a certain kind of quirky small business, many of them since departed, at the soda fountain of the old Elmwood Pharmacy, at Alka-Bulalian Books, specializing in books on the African diaspora, at the Soundwell, used and vintage hi-fi and stereo equipment. These places tended to have counters, extra chairs, gathering areas. And it was there that the tensions of Berkeley living, the competing claims on the heart of a Berkeleyite to follow one's bliss, but at the same time to reach a hand out into the void and feel another set of fingers taking hold of one's own, were resolved. These places were shrines to the classic Berkeley impulse to latch on to something tiny but crucial, the warm sound provided by vacuum tube amplifiers, the African roots of Jesus Christ and his teachings, or a perfectly constructed black and white, and pursue it with a mounting sense of self-discovery. But they were also gathering places. At their counters, the lonely amateur of Coleman or Marant's equipment, the student of Martin Bernal, could pull up a stool and find him or herself in the company of sympathetic minds. Of all these non-alcoholic taverns of the soul, these unofficial clubhouses of the oddball and outre, the purest, to my mind, are the used record stores. They come and go, Berrigan's, DBA Brown, Grooveyard, but there are always a few of them around, cramped and dusty or tidy and well-ordered, owned and staffed by doomed heroes of fandom. One day, not long after moving to the East Bay, I walked into one of those used vinyl soul taverns on the Oakland side of the city line. There was a big black dude working the counter and a little white guy carrying in boxes from the back. The morning's customers had arranged themselves at the front counter, old, young, black, white, and brown, Jews and Gentiles, a dentist, a guy out of work, theorizing, opining, tearing off woof tickets, hanging together. I didn't kid myself that these guys were united in perfect brotherhood. They had not solved the nation's racial woes or invented a better America. Nobody was asking for or granting forgiveness or reparations for slavery. They were just shooting the shit, passing the time, talking about something they loved in a little pocket of the big world for a little hour. Soon they would go their different ways into their discontinuous and disunited lives. But for the moment, for once, for the first time in years, I was where I had wanted to be all along. I had found a place where at least a trace of what I had lost on that journey from Columbia to Ito land, the dream I had believed in, the closest I had once known, could be found. I was home. Not long after that, the shop went out of business. It is in the nature of utopia to go out of business. And it has never really quite been replaced. And so, once again, as in The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, as in Yiddish Policeman's Union, I found myself obliged and eager to recreate through fiction, through storytelling and prose, the lost utopia that never quite happened, that I never quite knew, that I have never since forgotten, and that I have been losing and longing for all my life. Thank you.